Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a grey and soupy morning in November when I found myself once again seated by the hearth at 221B Baker Street, the rain tapping lightly against the windows like a timid visitor. The fire hissed and cracked with a nervous energy, as if aware that something sinister loomed beyond the veil of fog that choked the city. Holmes, in his usual languid repose, lounged in the armchair opposite mine, legs stretched and fingertips pressed together in quiet contemplation. He had scarcely moved since I entered half an hour ago. The Times lay discarded beside him, untouched. Even the pipe, his habitual companion during such bouts of reflection, remained cold on the mantel. I was about to remark upon this curious stillness when Mrs. Hudson burst in with uncharacteristic urgency, her eyes wide with restrained alarm. "There's someone downstairs asking for Mr. Holmes," she said, voice trembling. "Inspector Lestrade, sir, and he's not alone." Holmes sat up at once. "Show him in." Moments later, the familiar figure of Inspector Lestrade entered, though even he appeared disoriented and pale. Behind him came a younger constable, carrying a soaked oilskin bundle, which he placed gingerly on the floor before withdrawing silently. "Good morning, Lestrade," Holmes said coolly. "You look as though you've just seen a ghost." "I might as well have," the inspector muttered. "We've a situation on our hands, Holmes, one I can't make sense of, and I'd stake my badge there's more to it than meets the eye." He turned toward the bundle and unfolded the slick layers of cloth to reveal what looked at first like a shattered porcelain doll. But as the cloth fell away completely, I saw it for what it truly was, the lifeless face of a man, his expression frozen in shock, lips parted mid-scream, his skin pale from the cold and beaded with droplets from the fog. "The body was found just before dawn," Lestrade said, "in Belgrave Square, lying on the garden path like he'd simply stepped out for air and dropped dead in fright." "A mugging gone wrong," I suggested. Lestrade shook his head. "No wounds, no bruises, not a scratch. And more baffling still, his shoes and trousers were dry, though the rest of him was damp from the fog. No footprints leading to or from the scene. Nothing but that face, staring straight up through the mist." Holmes leaned forward, examining the corpse with narrowed eyes. He gently lifted the man's chin, then inspected the eyes and fingernails. "Time of death? Roughly between 2 and 4 this morning, the medical man says." "But there's more, Holmes," Lestrade added, glancing at us both. "We identified the victim. Name's Alfred Whitaker, a barrister, well known in his circles. Worked out of an office in Lincoln's Inn. But here's the twist. He was declared dead 3 days ago." I sat bolt upright. "Declared dead?" "Body found in the Thames. Face bashed beyond recognition, but the identification was confirmed by both his clerk and his sister. Funeral's scheduled for tomorrow." Holmes turned slowly to face the inspector. "So we are to believe Mr. Whitaker has died twice? Unless the man in the Thames wasn't him after all. Or," Holmes said softly, "unless the man now lying here is someone else altogether." We sat in silence for a moment as the fog pressed tighter against the windows. Holmes reached for his magnifying glass and peered closely at the dead man's neck. "There's a faint bruise beneath the ear," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "And what's this?" He parted the man's collar and revealed a peculiar marking just beneath the right clavicle, a strange circular brand, faded but still visible. "Lestrade, was this mark noted on the previous body?" "No, in fact, we didn't see anything like it then." "Then we must consider the possibility that neither corpse is Alfred Whitaker, or that they both are, and someone's playing a deeply twisted game." "Damn it, Holmes," Lestrade muttered, clearly rattled. "There were no footprints, nothing in the gardens. No one saw anything, and yet he's lying there like a ghost dropped him out of the sky." Holmes stood and turned to the window. "The fog," he said thoughtfully. "It's not just a curtain, it's a mask." Perfect cover for one who does not wish to be seen. And this face, he gestured toward the corpse, is not one of fright alone. It is recognition. He saw something in the fog, something or someone he knew. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. We're bringing in the family again. The sister's being escorted here as we speak, but this whole business, it doesn't add up. No, it doesn't, Holmes agreed. But it will. Watson, fetch your coat. I suspect the scene at Belgrave Square still has secrets to share. I did as instructed, though my thoughts swirled as heavily as the London mist outside. 2 deaths, 1 identity, no footprints, and a face frozen in terrified recognition. We descended into the fog, the world beyond 21B reduced to shadows and dim gaslight. As we climbed into the waiting cab, I could not help but glance once more at the pale face lying beneath the folds of wet cloth. The fog had taken many lives in London, but never had it returned one, only to claim him again. And behind that blank wall of mist, something moved, something with a face worth dying for. Twice. Chapter 2. A Visitor at Baker Street. The next morning dawned grey and still, with a light drizzle veiling the city in a melancholy hush. I arrived at Baker Street shortly after 8, as was often my habit, to find Holmes already awake and hunched over his breakfast. The remnants of toast lay cold on his plate, and a half-drained cup of tea rested beside the morning paper, which had been thoroughly marked with blue pencil along the margins. He looked up briefly as I entered, offering no more than a nod. His gaze was distant, and I could see by the slight narrowing of his eyes that some thought had seized him even before the day had begun. I took my seat near the hearth, warming my hands beside the fire, waiting for Holmes to speak. He did not immediately, and I knew better than to interrupt when his mind was at work. A long silence passed. Then he said, "Watson, you recall last night's commotion?" "Certainly," I replied. "That wretched scream, the sound of boots in the street. You said nothing at the time." "I said nothing," Holmes agreed, "because nothing had yet formed. But now, something quite peculiar has begun to take shape." He pushed the newspaper toward me. On the 3rd page, buried beneath a piece about an overturned hansom cab, a small column read, "Unidentified man found dead in fog. Victim suffered apparent fall. Authorities investigating." The article was brief. A man in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive coat but lacking any identification, had been found in an alley off Whitehall near the Admiralty Arch. The body bore no obvious injuries save a head wound, likely sustained in a fall, and there were no signs of robbery. The death, the report said, was assumed to be accidental, a tragic misstep in the thick fog of the previous night. I looked up. What of it? Tragic, yes, but hardly uncommon. Holmes tapped the article with one long finger. The fog last night was thick enough to obscure a man's vision, but not his sense, and that alley, Granger's Lane, is level ground. There is no incline from which to fall, no stairs, no wall above which one could lose his footing. So you believe it was not an accident? "I believe," said Holmes, "that this man died with a story on his lips, and someone ensured it would not be told." Before I could question him further, Mrs. Hudson entered the room with her usual cautious knock. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, rather agitated. Wouldn't give his name. Holmes rose without hesitation. "Send him in, please." Moments later, the door opened again, and a tall, angular man stepped inside. He was perhaps in his 40s, though hard living had given him a face more worn than his years. His eyes darted nervously about the room, and though he tried to compose himself, I could see the tremor in his hands. "Mr. Holmes," he said, removing his damp hat, "you must forgive the intrusion." "There is no intrusion, sir," Holmes said, gesturing for him to sit. "You're most welcome. What troubles you?" The man hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair across from the fire. "My name is Edwin Forsyth. I am or was a solicitor for the firm of Whittaker & Co. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly at the name. Whittaker, any relation to the deceased banker, Alfred Whittaker? Forsyth gave a slow nod. Yes, I was his legal advisor for 5 years, but more importantly, his confidant, at least I thought I was. He drew a small folded envelope from his coat. This arrived at my home late last night. No postmark. It was slid under my door. Holmes took the letter carefully and unfolded it. I rose and came to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. The letter was written in hurried, uneven strokes, clearly the work of someone under distress. They have found me again. I thought I was safe in the fog. There is no more time. If anything happens to me, tell Holmes. Tell him the man with the painted face walks again. He'll understand. A.W. A.W., I whispered. Alfred Whittaker. Forsyth nodded. I believe he sent it, though officially, Whittaker has been dead for nearly 2 years. Officially, Holmes echoed, and yet this letter is dated yesterday. Forsyth leaned forward. That's not all. I believe I saw him, Alfred, 2 nights ago. Or someone who looked very much like him. I was near Temple Bar, crossing into Fleet Street. A man passed me under the gaslight. Our eyes met. He recognized me, I'm sure of it. Then he turned and vanished into the fog. Holmes returned to his seat, steepling his fingers. And the man with the painted face? Do you know to whom he refers? Forsyth shuddered. No, but Whittaker used to speak of nightmares, of someone who wore a smile that didn't belong to him. I thought it nonsense at the time. A man burdened by guilt and failing health. But now, I'm not so sure. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he looked up at Forsyth. Mr. Forsyth, your visit may have arrived just in time. This case, he murmured, glancing once more at the crumpled letter, has the scent of something far older than we know, something that has merely changed its mask. I watched as he slipped the letter into his desk drawer and turned back to the window, where the rain had begun to ease, though the mist still hung over the rooftops like a veil. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. Inside, the mystery was only beginning to thicken. Chapter 3. The First Clues. By midday, Holmes had already decided upon our next move. The moment Forsyth left our rooms, visibly relieved but still shaken, Holmes turned briskly on his heel and began making preparations. We are going to Whitehall, he announced, to the alley where the unidentified man was found. I must see the place for myself. The fog had thinned but lingered in low patches across the cobbled streets as we made our way through the city in a hired cab. Holmes sat in silence for most of the ride, tapping his fingers lightly against his cane. His brows drawn in thought, I knew the rhythm well. It meant a theory was forming, but still too fragile to be voiced aloud. Granger's Lane was a narrow, grim stretch between 2 aging warehouses, set just beyond the busy pulse of Whitehall. A constable stood guard near the yellow cordon rope, chewing on a piece of straw with a bored expression until he caught sight of Holmes striding toward him with purpose. "You'll find nothing, sir," the constable said as he stepped aside. Just an unlucky man took a wrong step in the fog. Unlucky men rarely carry tailored overcoats and Italian leather gloves. Holmes replied smoothly. Was anything removed from the scene? The constable scratched his head. Just the body, sir. No belongings. No wallet, not even a hat. No hat, Holmes echoed softly. Curious. What did the body lie against? The man gestured toward a pile of crates stacked near the alley wall. There, sir. He was slumped on his side. Bit of blood at the base of the skull. Doctor said he likely struck it in a fall. Holmes stepped forward and crouched, examining the stonework and ground. I joined him cautiously, watching as he brushed aside some damp leaves and dirt. Moments later, he pulled a thin sliver of wood from between 2 cobbles. It was dark, stained, and splintered at one end. "Broken matchstick," he murmured, holding it to the light. "French make. See the reddish tint? They are dipped in phosphorus. Not common in England." He tucked it into his pocket and rose. "Watson," he said, "what do you observe about the crates?" I peered at them. "Ordinary shipping crates. Stained. One has a split corner, most likely from the rain." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet, this particular crate has sawdust beneath it, while the others do not." He bent and lifted the edge of the box with a grunt, revealing a patch of damp earth where the sawdust had clearly been disturbed recently. He reached inside, drawing forth a thin length of twine. "Someone tied something here, or hid it beneath." The constable approached, suddenly more attentive. "We didn't touch that, sir. Never even looked underneath." "Which is precisely why it is interesting," Holmes replied. As we continued inspecting the alley, Holmes's gaze kept drifting toward the brick wall opposite the crates. The lower section was chipped and blackened, as though something had scorched it long ago. But it was a single mark that drew his attention, a faint impression near the center, barely visible beneath the soot. He pulled a handkerchief from his coat and gently wiped the surface. Slowly, a rough shape emerged, a smear of chalk or perhaps soapstone, faded and water-streaked. It was a circle, perhaps 3 inches wide, with 2 short lines drawn across the top like eyes. "A face," Holmes murmured, "but not a human one. A caricature, grotesque, almost theatrical." He stepped back and tilted his head. "The man with the painted face," he said softly. I felt a chill as I stared at the crude drawing. "You think he was here?" "I think someone wanted us to believe he was," Holmes replied. "And therein lies the true deception." We left the alley shortly afterward, with Holmes silent once more. The cab rattled through the streets as he stared out the window, the clues clearly dancing in his mind. "Holmes," I ventured, "do you believe the man who died was Alfred Whitaker?" He shook his head. "No. Whitaker was too careful to leave himself exposed in such a public place. The letter Forsyth received proves he was still alive after the death occurred. But the man who died may have been following him or sent to impersonate him. A double? Possibly. Or a decoy. This case, Watson, is not merely one of mistaken identity. It is a tale woven from false trails, designed to pull us away from the truth." Back at Baker Street, Holmes withdrew the broken matchstick, the twine, and the soiled handkerchief with the image pressed faintly into its fibers. He laid them out upon the desk like pieces of a riddle yet to be spoken aloud. He said nothing for a long while. Then, in the dim light of the study, he spoke as if to himself. "They've laid the stage well," he said. "The fog, the face, the alley, the dead man with no name. Every element crafted to appear accidental, but accidents do not tie knots in twine, nor do they draw symbols on walls. This is not the end of the mystery, Watson. It is only the prologue." I sat beside him as he lit a fresh pipe, the room thickening with a different sort of fog, the kind born not of mist, but of unfolding thought. And as the smoke curled toward the ceiling, I could feel it in the air. Something was watching us from behind the curtain of London's gloom. And Holmes, as always, was preparing to step through it. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The day after our visit to Belgrave Square, Holmes and I found ourselves in the drawing room of Miss Eliza Whitaker, sister to the late, or perhaps not so late, Alfred Whitaker. Her lodgings were modest but tastefully arranged, with framed sketches of pastoral scenes on the walls and a scent of dried lavender in the air. She was a woman of around 35, upright in posture and firm of voice, but with eyes that carried shadows of sleepless nights. She sat rigidly on a floral settee as Holmes questioned her, not unkindly, but with the deliberate precision of a surgeon making an incision. "You last saw your brother when, Miss Whitaker?" Holmes asked. 3 nights before his body was found in the Thames, she replied. He dined with me here. He was in excellent spirits. We discussed his upcoming case, a fraud matter, I believe, though he was uncharacteristically tight-lipped about the details. After dinner, he left around 9, saying he had business at his chambers. And you confirmed the identification of the man pulled from the river? I did, she said, her voice catching for the first time. The face was ruined, but the hands, the ring, and the cufflinks were his. Even the watch. It was my father's, and Alfred wore it every day. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes distant, curious. And yet yesterday you confirmed that the man found in Belgrave Square was your brother as well. Miss Whittaker paled. It was him. I swear it. The face, the expression, it was Alfred, unmistakably. I don't know what to think anymore. Before Holmes could speak again, Lestrade entered, followed by 2 figures who were clearly out of sorts with their surroundings. One was a thin, reedy man with spectacles and tobacco-stained fingers, Mr. Edgar Lyle, Whittaker's law clerk. The other, in stark contrast, was a heavy-set fellow with thick black eyebrows and a florid face that betrayed years of indulgence, Mr. Horace Penmore, a former client of Whittaker's. I thought it best you meet those closest to the deceased, Lestrade muttered to Holmes, then added in a louder tone, Mr. Lyle and Mr. Penmore, this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Lyle offered a brief nod, clearly nervous. Mr. Penmore, however, looked Holmes over with an air of suspicion. I don't know what all this fuss is about, Penmore said, folding his arms. Alfred was a fine barrister, but he wasn't a saint. Had his share of enemies, I dare say. Enemies? Holmes said mildly. That's an interesting choice of word. Would you count yourself among them? Penmore flushed. Certainly not. I owed the man more than I can say. Got me out of a dreadful scrape last year. But he did mention, offhand, mind you, that he'd crossed someone dangerous. Didn't say who. Just that he feared something might be coming. Holmes leaned forward. When did he say this? 2 weeks ago. At my club. He brushed it off, but it lingered in his eyes. And what about you, Mr. Lyle? Holmes turned to the clerk. Was Mr. Whittaker behaving unusually in recent days? Lyle blinked behind his glasses. Yes. He'd grown distracted. Locked himself in his office for hours. Wouldn't even let the cleaning woman in. And he asked me to destroy a bundle of letters last Thursday, said they were personal. I didn't read them, of course. Holmes raised an eyebrow. But you still have them? Lyle colored slightly. I hadn't yet done it. They're still in my desk. Good. Bring them to Baker Street by this evening. Lestrade, meanwhile, had taken a notebook from his coat. For the record, Penmore, can you confirm where you were last night, between 2 and 4 in the morning? Penmore scoffed. Asleep at my club. Ask the porter. I came in at midnight and didn't stir till breakfast. And you, Lyle? Holmes asked. I was at home with my wife. We were both in bed by 10. Holmes rose and crossed to the fireplace, where he stood silently for a moment, watching the flames. Tell me, Miss Whittaker, he said at last, did your brother have any rivals? Legal or personal? She hesitated. He did mention a disagreement with a fellow barrister, a Mr. Basil Corwin. They were once friends, but something turned sour between them. Lestrade made a note. We'll bring him in next. Holmes turned. One final question. Did your brother have any contact with a foreigner in recent months? Someone unfamiliar to your circle? Perhaps vaguely unsettling? Miss Whittaker frowned. There was one gentleman. A Mr. Duchesne, I believe. French or possibly Belgian. He came to the house twice asking for Alfred. Tall, dark hair, wore gloves, even indoors. Alfred said he was consulting on a private matter. I thought little of it at the time. Holmes gave a rare smile. Thank you. That may prove important. When the questioning ended, the guests departed one by one. Penmore with a growl, Lyle with an apologetic glance, and Miss Whittaker with a bowed head. Holmes stood unmoving for a long time afterward, gazing into the fireplace. I approached him cautiously. "You think one of them knows more than they admit?" "I think," he said slowly, "that the circle around Alfred Whittaker is smaller than it appears, and every one of them is standing too close to the fire. Some will burn their fingers, others may already have." "What about the second body?" I asked. "The man from the Thames." Holmes turned to me. "If that body wasn't Alfred Whittaker, Watson, then someone went to great lengths to make us believe it was. The question is why, and whether the answer lies in jealousy, revenge, or something far more calculated." Outside, the fog pressed again against the windows, thickening by the minute. The face in the mist still lingered in my memory, that expression of sheer terror, frozen for eternity. Holmes fetched his violin and drew the bow gently across the strings, a low, pondering hum filling the room. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we pay a visit to Mr. Basil Corwin." And with that, the bow struck a minor chord that seemed to echo the unease settling in both our minds. The game, it seemed, was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Red Herring. The following morning, as the city stirred beneath a blanket of damp mist, Holmes and I made our way through the alleys behind Lincoln's Inn. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the dark outlines of spires and chimneys like watchful sentinels in the waking light. We had an appointment with Mr. Basil Corwin, barrister, former friend to Alfred Whittaker, and, if Miss Whittaker's recollection was accurate, a man with reason to resent the deceased. Corwin's office was situated on the second floor of a brick building just off Chancery Lane. It was austere and methodically tidy, lined with books whose bindings showed the wear of frequent use. He greeted us with cool civility, his manner that of a man who knew precisely how much to say and no more. Holmes introduced us, and Corwin gestured for us to sit. "I understand," Corwin said, steepling his fingers, "that this is in connection to Whittaker's peculiar reappearance." "You've heard, then," Holmes said. Corwin gave a thin smile. "The legal community is small, Mr. Holmes, and gossip travels faster than any messenger. I don't suppose you're here to accuse me of anything, but let's not waste time. Alfred and I had our differences." "What sort of differences?" Holmes asked, already inspecting the man with those unblinking eyes of his. Corwin sighed and leaned back. "Professional ones. A dispute over a case. Alfred once represented a client I had refused to take on, an unscrupulous financier with questionable ethics. I warned him, told him the man would soil his reputation, but Alfred went ahead anyway. Made a name for himself when he won, but it cost him the trust of more respectable circles." "Did that end your friendship?" I asked. Corwin hesitated. "No, not at once. But it started the rot, if you'll forgive the phrase. After that, we rarely agreed on anything. Our correspondence grew terse. Then stopped altogether. I suppose we simply outgrew one another, or perhaps he outgrew me." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he asked, "Where were you on the night Alfred Whittaker's second body was found?" Corwin raised an eyebrow. "At my club, the Perseus, from 10 until nearly 3, playing cards with 3 other men, all of whom will vouch for me. I didn't step foot outside." "A firm alibi," Holmes murmured. "And what of Whittaker's supposed death in the Thames?" "Were you present at the viewing of the body?" "No, I was abroad. Returned just yesterday, in fact, a conference in Bruges. Only learned of Alfred's death on the return train from Calais." Holmes nodded, absorbing the answer without expression. "And Mr. Duchesne?" he asked. Corwin stiffened slightly at the name, a flicker too quick to catch unless one was looking for it. "I'm sorry?" "A foreign gentleman visited Whittaker's residence. Do you know him?" Corwin's face returned to its neutral mask. No, though Alfred did take on a few continental clients in recent months. Perhaps he was one of them. Would you say Whittaker was a man to make enemies? Holmes asked lightly. Corwin allowed himself a short laugh. We all make enemies in law, Mr. Holmes, but Alfred had a way of collecting them. Clients he refused, partners he bested in court, colleagues who resented his rise. He was brilliant, no question, but arrogant. Sometimes cruel. Cruel? I asked, surprised. To those beneath him. Clerks, secretaries. I once saw him dismiss a young assistant with such venom it left the poor boy in tears. Holmes stood. Thank you for your time, Mr. Corwin. You've been most helpful. Corwin stood as well, but narrowed his eyes. Mr. Holmes, do you believe he was truly murdered? Or is this some elaborate hoax? Holmes smiled slightly. That depends on whether the man who died was Alfred Whittaker at all. We left the office with the sound of a ticking grandfather clock echoing behind us. Outside, the fog had thinned to a light mist, and Holmes paused on the steps, eyes turned skyward. Well? I asked him. He seemed candid, honest even. He was too composed, Holmes replied. He's a man used to performance, of course, but that reaction to Duchesne's name was telling. He knows something. Do you suspect him? I suspect his usefulness in distracting us, Holmes replied. Which may in fact be precisely what someone intends. The obvious tensions, the professional rivalry, the timely absence abroad, it all aligns a little too neatly, almost as though he were meant to be our first conclusion. A red herring, I said slowly. Precisely, but that does not mean he is entirely innocent, only that we are not yet meant to see what part he truly plays. As we returned to Baker Street, the midday crowds bustled past us in carriages and cloaks. Holmes fell into silence, thinking deeply, his brow furrowed. When we arrived, Mrs. Hudson handed Holmes a sealed envelope with no postmark. This came by hand, she said. A boy delivered it. Said it was urgent. Holmes opened it at once and read the contents in silence. Well, I asked. It's from Edgar Lyle, he said. The letters Whittaker had instructed him to destroy were not merely personal. One of them contains a threat, an anonymous note clipped from newspapers, warning him to abandon his current case or face public ruin and final darkness. And Lyle kept it? I asked, astonished, which means Lyle is smarter than he appears, or more frightened than we guessed. Holmes handed me the note. The threat was crude but chilling, composed of jagged letters pasted onto thick stationery. Final darkness, I repeated aloud. Holmes tapped his fingers against the window pane. The person behind this is playing for time, Watson. They want confusion. Doubt. Our focus on Corwin may be precisely what they planned. Then where do we look next? I asked. Holmes turned slowly to me. The answer, my dear Watson, lies with the body in the Thames. It's time we asked who stood to benefit from Alfred Whittaker being declared dead, before he truly was. And with that, he reached for his coat again, his eyes gleaming with renewed intensity. The red herring had been cast, but Holmes was already swimming upstream. Chapter 6. A Hidden Inconsistency. It was nearing 3:30 when Holmes and I arrived at the Southwark mortuary, a dim, draughty structure pressed between a chapel and a coal depot. A fine drizzle misted the air as we stepped from the hansom cab. Holmes said little on the journey, but sat with fingers steepled, his gaze distant. It was not the fog outside that veiled his thoughts, but something more intricate, more calculated. The mortuary attendant, a stooped man named Pierce, met us at the door and led us to a small room at the rear, where the body pulled from the Thames just 4 days prior had been kept under official seal. The room smelled of lye and mildew. A single gas lamp flickered against the tiled walls as Pierce drew back the sheet. The body was badly degraded, waterlogged, bruised and pale, but enough remained of the features to see the ravages of the river. Holmes examined the corpse in silence, his eyes sweeping over the wrists, neck, and fingers with delicate precision. "This was the man Miss Whittaker identified as her brother?" Holmes asked quietly. "Indeed," Pierce replied. "And Mr. Lyle, too. Both said it was Alfred Whittaker, based on the ring, cufflinks, and facial structure. What remained of it?" Holmes nodded. "And the body was found where?" "North end of the river, just off Millbank, caught in a pile of reeds by a constable on patrol." "Fully clothed?" Holmes asked. "Aye. Boots, trousers, waistcoat, and a rather fine overcoat." Holmes stepped back and folded his arms. "Strange. The river tends to strip a man bare, especially in that current. But this one remained dressed and in excellent quality garments." He turned to me then. "Watson, do you recall the boots of the second body, the one in Belgrave Square?" "Yes. Dry, curiously enough, as if they hadn't touched the ground." "Exactly. Now look here." He motioned toward the corpse's feet. The boots, though dulled by water, were made of the same leather, identical in make to those we'd seen on the second man. "They're the same," I said. "But that would suggest that someone dressed both bodies alike." "Or rather," Holmes interrupted, "that someone wanted them to be taken for the same man." The effect was convincing enough for Miss Whittaker and Mr. Lyle, until the real Alfred Whittaker turned up dead a second time. I stared at the corpse. "So who is this man, if not Whittaker?" "Someone who shares his build and rough features," Holmes mused. "Perhaps a vagrant. Someone with no family to claim him, but enough resemblance to pass a brief, grief-stricken inspection." He motioned for Pierce to bring him the personal effects retrieved from the body. Among the damp belongings were a watch, the aforementioned cufflinks, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a sealed envelope now warped by moisture. Holmes handled the items carefully, studying the watch under the lamplight. "The same engraving as reported by Miss Whittaker to Alfred from father, 1879. But see here." He held it out to me. "The clasp is broken. There are scratch marks around the back plate. This watch was forced open, and recently." "You mean someone tampered with it?" "Precisely. Likely to swap the mechanism or plant the inscription." Pierce looked uneasy. "But why go to all this trouble?" "To ensure the wrong man was mourned," Holmes replied. "To buy time while the real Whittaker remained alive, or more likely, while someone else plotted how to silence him permanently." The envelope intrigued Holmes most of all. Though damp and misshapen, it bore the name A. Whittaker in elegant, swirling ink. He turned it in his hands, noting a smudged seal. "Watson, open this carefully, if you please." I peeled back the envelope with as much delicacy as I could muster. The paper inside had dried unevenly and clung to the folds. Eventually, I unfolded it and laid it flat. It was a single sheet, the ink bled in places, but still legible. "You were warned. The agreement was clear. You brought this upon yourself. There will be no third chance." D. Holmes studied the signature. "D again. This isn't the first appearance of that letter." "Duchesne?" I asked. "The foreign gentleman mentioned by Miss Whittaker?" "Possibly. Or another entirely. But the threat is specific. There will be no third chance." "Which implies this letter was sent after the first warning, the one Lyle kept." He stood abruptly. "We must see that note again. There may be something we missed." As we left the mortuary, I caught Holmes glancing once more at the body on the table. "You don't pity him?" I asked, my voice low. "I pity them both," he said, stepping out into the wet air. "One drowned in silence, the other in terror. The river was only the method. The true killer walks dry and dressed, somewhere behind the curtain of all this performance." We returned to Baker Street as dusk settled over the rooftops. Lyle was already waiting, seated nervously in the parlor with a sealed envelope in his lap. He rose quickly when Holmes entered and extended the packet. "I thought you should have the rest of it," he said. "I read through the other letters. They're mundane, old correspondence with clients, but this is the first warning. I'm sure of it." Holmes opened the note and laid it beside the one from the corpse's effects. Again, words were clipped from newspapers and pasted in irregular lines. "You will not speak. You will not expose what has been hidden. One more word, and the face in the fog shall find you." Holmes tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. The phrase, "the face in the fog," it's theatrical, deliberate. It speaks to identity, to illusion, and to fear. "Do you think it's literal?" I asked. "Could someone have used a disguise?" "More than that," Holmes said softly. "I believe someone became Alfred Whitaker, took his place, perhaps for days, while the real man was dead or imprisoned. And when the second body turned up, our imposter vanished." Lyle looked horrified. "But why? What could anyone gain by doing such a thing?" "That," Holmes said, moving toward the fire, "is what we are about to find out, and to do so, we must find the one person who stood to benefit most from Whitaker's erasure. His absence, not his death. Someone who needed him out of the way for just a few crucial days." He turned to me then, eyes flashing. "Watson, tomorrow we go to Lincoln's Inn again. Not for the people, but for the papers. If Whitaker was hiding something, it will not be in his body, but in his briefcase." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. It was a grey and listless morning when Holmes and I returned to Lincoln's Inn, the chill wind pulling at our collars and sending brittle leaves scuttling across the stone pavement like whispers of the dead. The fog had thinned, yet a strange stillness hung over the square, as though the very bricks held their breath. Mr. Edgar Lyle was waiting at the entrance to Whitaker's chambers. He looked paler than before, and his hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with the key. "I haven't entered since," he said, trailing off. Holmes gave a curt nod. "That is well. The less disturbance, the better." The door swung open to reveal a suite of modest but tastefully furnished rooms. Books lined every available shelf, documents lay neatly stacked across the large oak desk, and a faint aroma of pipe tobacco lingered in the air. Despite Whitaker's apparent absence for over a week, the room felt oddly recent, as if he might walk back in at any moment and pick up where he'd left off. Holmes crossed the threshold slowly, eyes darting over every detail. The absence of dust on certain surfaces, the slight angle of the desk chair, the faint smudge of a shoe print near the hearth. "Someone's been here," he murmured. Lyle looked startled. "I swear, Mr. Holmes, I haven't—" "Not you. Someone else. Recently. Within the last 2 days at most." He crouched beside the desk, lifting the corner of a rug to reveal a shallow depression in the wood. "A safe was here," he said quietly. "Recently removed. Note the scuff marks. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You think it was a robbery?" Holmes shook his head. "Not in the traditional sense. Nothing else is disturbed. Whoever came here wasn't searching. They knew. They came for that one item, retrieved it, and left without hesitation." Lyle seemed genuinely distressed. "A safe? I never knew he had one." Holmes stood and began searching the drawers of the desk. "Because he didn't wish you to? A man like Whitaker, balancing dangerous clients and darker secrets, would keep his most damning documents close and hidden." He paused, lifting a paperweight shaped like a lion and examining the surface beneath. Then he opened the bottom drawer and removed a thin, hardbound ledger. He flipped through it quickly, then stopped on a page about halfway through. "Watson, come look at this." I stepped beside him. The page contained a series of initials, case numbers, and coded annotations. It meant little to me, but Holmes pointed to a specific entry. Client D. Disbursement rendered. Terms not disclosed. See arrangement file, Mount 13. Client D, Holmes repeated. Again, the same initial as the threat letters, and this arrangement file. I believe it was what lay in the missing safe. Lyle leaned over, squinting. That's Whitaker's personal shorthand. He didn't let anyone else touch these ledgers, but I do recall seeing an envelope marked Father Teen once. He kept it in a box on the upper shelf behind the curtain. I assumed it was old correspondence. Holmes immediately moved to the curtain and pulled it back to reveal a narrow wooden shelf. Dust coated most of the papers there, except for a bare space about the size of a folio envelope. Gone, Holmes said, which confirms the removal. Just then, a sharp knock echoed through the corridor. Lyle went to answer, and moments later returned with a red-faced constable, out of breath. "Mr. Tsu, Holmes," the man panted. "You're needed at Scotland Yard. Immediately. There's been another body." Holmes turned slowly. "Where?" "South Bank. Just off Lambeth. Same signs, same message clipped to the collar." Holmes froze for just a moment before seizing his coat and gesturing for me to follow. "This changes everything, Watson." The carriage ride to the South Bank was swift but silent. Holmes sat with his chin on his chest, brow furrowed in what I recognized as profound calculation. We arrived to find the street cordoned off, a small crowd already gathered behind the constables holding the line. The body lay in a narrow alley behind a boarded-up shop. It was that of a man in his early 40s, wearing a dark suit and bowler hat. His eyes stared up in blank terror, mouth slightly open, as if caught in mid-sentence. Pinned to his lapel was a torn scrap of newsprint, bearing the now all-too-familiar message. "The face in the fog sees all." Holmes crouched low and examined the man's wrists and fingernails. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no wound. Only that same frozen look of horror. "Who is he?" I asked. Lestrade, appearing beside us, answered grimly. "Name's Orton Blevins. Bookkeeper, worked for a firm in Clerkenwell. No record, no enemies. We found this in his wallet." He handed Holmes a visiting card. A. Whitaker, Esquernes, Lincoln's Inn, Fields. Holmes stared at it, unmoving. "The web grows larger," he said quietly. This man was either a loose thread or a witness. Lestrade frowned. "To what?" Holmes rose. "To something he didn't even know he saw. The fog hides many faces, but this one is beginning to take shape." I stepped closer. "But Holmes, if Whitaker was the target, why kill again now? He's already dead." "Because someone is cleaning up. Covering tracks. If the first murder was to delay the truth and the second was to silence Whitaker, then this," he gestured to the corpse, "is panic. Someone is afraid of being seen." He looked past the alley toward the river. The face in the fog. Not merely a threat, a name or a symbol, perhaps even an identity. The constables moved to cover the body, and Holmes took one final look before turning on his heel. "Watson," he said, "we must return to Baker Street at once. There is someone I need to speak with, someone who may already be in danger." "Who?" "Miss Whitaker." I hurried after him, my heart pounding. The fog had begun to roll in again, thicker now, curling around the cobbles like something alive, and in the silence between footsteps I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. We arrived at Miss Eliza Whitaker's lodgings in Bloomsbury just after sunset. The fog had thickened once again, sweeping in from the river in a low, rolling tide that swallowed lamplight and muffled footsteps. It clung to the air like a secret. Holmes moved quickly, his coat drawn tight around his shoulders, his eyes darting with quiet urgency. Mrs. Meeks, the landlady, answered the door with a flustered expression and a rag in her hand. "She's upstairs, Mr. Holmes. she said. But she's had a terrible fright. Said someone tried to follow her on her way home not an hour ago. She's locked herself in and won't come out. Keeps asking for you. Holmes offered only a curt nod and took the stairs 2 at a time. I followed close behind. At the landing, he knocked gently. "Eliza, it's Holmes," he called. There was a brief pause, then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened a crack and Miss Whittaker's pale face appeared in the lamplight. "Thank God," she whispered, stepping back to let us in. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her hands trembling. I knew you'd come." Holmes stepped inside, scanning the room with a glance. Everything was as it had been during our last visit, tidy, well kept, with that lingering scent of lavender, but now a note of tension seemed to hum in the very walls. "Tell me exactly what happened," Holmes said, gently taking her by the elbow and guiding her to the settee. "I went out just after 5, she began, "to collect some books from the stationer. On my way back, I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I turned a corner off Russell Square, and there he was, just standing in the fog. A tall man, in a dark coat, watching me. He didn't move. Just stood there, like a statue. What did he look like? I couldn't say. His face was obscured, but when I began to walk faster, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned once more, and he'd vanished." Holmes nodded slowly. "And since returning here, has anything else occurred?" She hesitated, then reached for a letter lying on the table. "This was pushed under the door not 10 minutes before you arrived." He took it and unfolded the page. No envelope this time. The message, again composed of pasted clippings, read, "You are being watched. You are not safe. The fog is patient." Holmes handed it to me, his expression unreadable. Then, turning back to Miss Whittaker, he said quietly, "Eliza, I need you to answer a question with absolute honesty. Did your brother ever mention anything to you about a client or associate by the name of Duchesne?" Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes, twice, I believe. The second time was the night before he disappeared. He was nervous." Not like him. He kept pacing. Said Duchesne had made an offer he wasn't sure he could refuse. I pressed him, but he brushed it aside. Said it was nothing. Holmes stood and moved to the window, peering out into the shrouded street below. "The man you saw today, it may have been this Duchesne, or someone working for him." "You think they mean to harm me?" she asked quietly. "I think," Holmes said carefully, "you may know more than you realize. And whoever orchestrated this affair is growing desperate." He turned to her fully. "Tell me, have you been to your brother's chambers since his death?" "No, I couldn't bear it." "Then you wouldn't know whether anything was removed?" She shook her head. "Very well," Holmes said, reaching into his coat and removing a folded note. "I want you to write a short letter to Mr. Basil Corwin, your brother's former friend. Invite him here tomorrow morning for tea. Say nothing of our visit or the letters, or your fear. Keep the tone light. Mention a few memories of your brother. May I trust you to do that?" "Yes," she said, though clearly puzzled. "But why?" Holmes gave her a faint smile. "Because we're going to see if he takes the bait." Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes seemed more animated than he had in days. He paced the length of the sitting room, his hands behind his back, the fire throwing long, flickering shadows across the walls. I knew better than to interrupt during these stretches of activity. At last, he stopped and turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the layout of Whittaker's chambers?" "Of course. 2 rooms, outer office and inner sanctum. A curtain behind the shelves where the safe had been concealed." "Precisely. But more importantly, do you recall the single painting above the desk?" I frowned. "A pastoral scene. Cows in a meadow." Holmes nodded. "And the frame?" "Ornate, gilded, slightly chipped on the lower edge." Holmes crossed to the bookshelf and pulled down one of our own framed etchings. That painting concealed a cavity in the wall. I'd wager a second compartment lay behind it, one our intruder overlooked. I stood. Then we must return. Not yet, Holmes said. Not until morning. I've arranged for the constables to shadow Miss Whittaker's street overnight. If someone is indeed watching her, we'll know soon enough. I stared at him. You believe Corwin is involved? Holmes lit his pipe. Corwin is a brilliant manipulator. Whether he's at the heart of this or merely a pawn, I intend to find out. Tomorrow's meeting with Miss Whittaker will give him an opportunity to betray himself, if not with words, then with silence. And Duchesne. Holmes exhaled a slow plume of smoke. He remains the key. A foreign name, always in shadow. I've sent a wire to my contacts in Paris and Brussels. If Duchesne exists in any public record, I'll know before long. He moved to the window and stood silently for several moments, staring out into the mist-shrouded street. Then he said, "Watson, what do you make of the phrase, 'the face in the fog'?" I thought for a moment. It suggests something hidden, waiting, a threat without form, a phantom. Or, Holmes said softly, a mirror, a mask worn by another, a man who became Whittaker for a time. Just long enough to sign something, seal a deal, or vanish with something valuable. This wasn't just murder, it was substitution. A knock at the door interrupted us. It was a constable, breathless and flushed from the cold. "Message from the yard, sir. Mr. Lyle was found unconscious outside his home not half an hour ago. No signs of robbery, but there was another letter in his pocket." Holmes took the letter, unfolded it, and read aloud. "You asked too many questions. Next time, it won't be a warning." He looked up at me, and for the first time in many days, his expression darkened. "They're accelerating, Watson. Someone's beginning to lose control of the plan. That's when the mask slips, and the real face emerges." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The fog had not lifted by morning. If anything, it had thickened into a dense, suffocating shroud that turned gaslight to dull amber and left the streets slick with dew. Outside Miss Whittaker's Bloomsbury lodgings, two plainclothes constables stood at strategic angles, appearing to loiter as chimney sweeps or street surveyors. From an upper window across the street, Holmes and I observed everything, waiting. "I received word from Brussels an hour ago," Holmes said, his eyes fixed on the street below. "There is a Henri Duchesne, real enough, but he's no client. He's a known confidence man, continental fraudster with a taste for political blackmail and vanished fortunes." "And now," I said, "he's circling London under a blanket of fog." "Or someone is using his name," Holmes replied. "Which is more troubling? You recall the letter Lyle received before his attack?" I nodded. The message still lay on our table, its clipped words now etched into my mind. "You asked too many questions. Next time, it won't be a warning." "Someone feared what Lyle might remember, or already had," Holmes said. "It's not just a silencing. It's a message to all others who know fragments of the truth." At that moment, Miss Whittaker's door opened. She stepped outside with a light shawl over her shoulders, her posture composed but tense. Just behind her came Mr. Basil Corwin, well-groomed as ever, carrying a small parcel. Holmes straightened at once. "Right on time," he said. "Let us see how the serpent coils." The two descended the steps together and crossed into a quiet cafe nearby, visible from our perch. Inside, they took a table by the window. Tea was brought. Conversation ensued. Miss Whittaker appeared polite, even warm. Corwin smiled in all the right places, but something about his posture was off. His shoulders held too high, his fingers too still on the teacup. Holmes watched without blinking. He's uneasy. She's doing well, drawing him in, letting him talk. The question is whether he came with an agenda. "Would he risk harming her in public?" I asked. "He needn't. He may be here to confirm something. See whether she knows more than she should. 15 minutes passed. Then Corwin rose, bowed lightly, and exited. Miss Whittaker remained behind, as we had arranged. Holmes waited for Corwin to vanish down the foggy lane before we descended. Inside the cafe, Eliza looked up as we entered, her expression taut with emotion. "Well?" Holmes asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "He didn't mention anything unusual," she said, her voice low. "But he kept circling back to Alfred's letters, asked if I had them, if I planned to go through his personal effects. He even offered to help." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the parcel?" She handed it to him. He said it was something my brother had left with him, a keepsake. Holmes opened the box with care. Inside lay a silver locket, polished and gleaming despite the circumstances. He turned it over in his palm. "Your brother didn't wear jewelry, did he?" Holmes asked. "Never," she replied at once. Holmes opened the locket. Inside were 2 tiny portraits, one of Alfred Whittaker, the other of a man neither of us recognized, older, severe-eyed, with a scar just visible above his right brow. Behind the portraits, a folded scrap of paper was tucked, bearing a number, 13B. Holmes looked up, a slow breath escaping his lips. "There's the second breadcrumb." "The safe file?" I asked. "Or the second hiding place," Holmes said. "The missing arrangement file may have been duplicated. One for the safe, one for the fallback. Whittaker was no fool. He feared someone might come looking." He closed the locket and turned to Eliza. "You've done splendidly. Return home for now. Remain cautious. You're being watched still." We returned once more to Lincoln's Inn. The fog had begun to lift from the square, revealing the angular shadows of the old stone buildings. The chambers remained locked, but Holmes produced a key given earlier by Mr. Lyle. Inside, everything was as before, except Holmes now moved with precise purpose. He returned to the desk, retrieved the pastoral painting from the wall, and began tapping lightly along the plaster. After a moment, he smiled. "Watson." "Here." He pressed against a subtle indentation just right of center. A panel gave way with a soft creak, revealing a narrow recess behind the wall. Inside sat a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. Holmes removed it and unwrapped the contents, a collection of letters, a red notebook, and a single folded sheet marked File 13B. He spread the documents on the desk. The letters were in French. Holmes translated quickly, his eyes widening with each line. "They're from Duchesne," he said. "Actual correspondence, not threats, instructions. They reference an agreement made under duress, a coercion of sorts. Whittaker was made to act as intermediary in an acquisition." "What kind of acquisition?" Holmes opened the red notebook. Inside was a ledger of names, coded payments, and dates, some going back 6 years. "A shell company," Holmes murmured. "A network used to hide assets, blackmail money, bribery payoffs, and the final page, look here." I leaned closer. "Final disbursement scheduled. March 9th. Disguise complete. D to assume identity. Witness disposal arranged." I felt the hairs on my neck rise. Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "The man we saw die in Belgrave Square may not have been Whittaker, Watson. He may have been Duchesne himself, or someone posing as either man. But why? Because the entire scheme hinged on deception. Whittaker was forced to stage his death, likely under duress, to allow someone else to act in his name. But something went wrong. Whittaker may have refused to follow through. He may have tried to warn someone, his sister. Perhaps. I asked the question both of us had avoided until then. Then who was the second victim, the one with the visiting card? Holmes looked down at the page again. A witness, a courier, someone who saw the mask come off. And for that, he was silenced. He gathered the letters and carefully returned them to the oilskin. "We must act quickly. I believe another move is imminent." Corwin was testing Eliza, but he may now realize she has no proof. As we stepped back into the square, a young constable hurried toward us, breathless. "Mr. Holmes, urgent message from Baker Street. A fire's broken out, Miss Whitaker's residence." Holmes didn't speak. He simply ran. By the time we reached Bloomsbury, the fire brigade was already hard at work. Flames licked at the upper windows of the boarding house, casting an eerie orange glow through the receding fog. A crowd had gathered, murmuring in dread. We pushed through and found Mrs. Meeks in tears, wrapped in a shawl, soot on her face. "She's out," she cried. "Thank God she's out. That man, you sent him, he got her out in time." "What man?" Holmes demanded. "I thought he was with you, a tall fellow, dark coat. Said he was under orders to fetch her. She followed him. He was so convincing she didn't question it." Holmes's face darkened. "He's taken her," I said. "No," Holmes replied coldly. "He's given himself away." The fog had begun to burn off under the pressure of rising smoke, but in its place was something far more dangerous. Clarity. Holmes turned sharply toward me. "We have less than a day to stop this, Watson. The mask is slipping, and whoever is beneath it just made a mistake." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. By nightfall, the flames had died down, leaving Miss Whitaker's boarding house in a blackened, skeletal state. The crowd had dispersed, and only a few smoldering embers glowed behind the charred timbers. Holmes stood at the edge of the ruin, unmoving, his gaze fixed not on the wreckage, but on the absence within it. "Eliza Whitaker was never meant to die tonight," he murmured. "Not yet. The fire was misdirection, a smokescreen, both literal and strategic." "But she escaped," I said. "That man, whoever he was, pulled her from the fire. Why save her?" "To gain her trust," Holmes replied. "He needed to separate her from us. That was the plan all along." I stared at him, understanding dawning slowly. "You think the same man who orchestrated the fire also pretended to rescue her?" Holmes gave a grim nod. "And now he has her alone, perhaps somewhere she believes is safe. Somewhere she will speak freely." "And if she tells him about the locket?" I asked. Holmes turned, his coat fluttering in the smoky breeze. "Then her life is measured in minutes, not hours." We hurried back to Baker Street, where Holmes pored over the locket once more. He placed it beside the red notebook and the series of clipped messages. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm against the desk. I'd seen him like this before, just before the final stroke of a solution took shape in his mind. "She wasn't just a bystander," he said softly. "That's what's changed. The moment they realized she might know something, she became a threat. That fire, Watson, it wasn't only an attempt to distract us. It was a message, a demonstration of reach. And yet they chose not to kill her immediately. Why? To draw us out?" "No," Holmes said, shaking his head. "To listen, to interrogate her subtly. They're looking for something, confirmation. The notebook, perhaps. Or the hidden file. Or—" He stopped suddenly, eyes fixed on the red leather cover. With great care, he opened it again to the final page. "Final disbursement scheduled. March 9th. Disguise complete. D to assume identity. Witness disposal arranged." "Watson," Holmes said slowly. "What if D didn't stand for Duchesne after all?" I frowned. "But the letters were meant to suggest Duchesne. The real man may have never set foot in London, but someone used his name, his legend, to cloak a much more mundane villainy. And who would benefit from Alfred Whitaker's disappearance? I considered it. Corwin? He stands to inherit half the estate. Yes, but more than that. Control. Corwin had access to Whitaker's private affairs, enough to know the clients. The shell corporations, enough to know there was danger and that his friend had grown uneasy with their dealings. If Whittaker was preparing to expose them, if he had evidence, then Corwin would have every reason to erase him. But that would make Corwin not just complicit in fraud, I said, but murder. Worse, Holmes replied. It makes him D. He paced rapidly now, the lines of the room disappearing behind the blur of his coat. And the masked man in the fog? Corwin again. Or someone hired by him, but the way he's operated, the false deaths, the letters, the performance, it smacks of theatre, as though each step was staged to evoke a reaction. From whom? I asked. From us, he said. From Whittaker's clients, from those who might uncover the truth. Just then, there was a knock at the door. A constable entered, breathless once more. We've located Miss Whittaker, sir, he said, or we believe we have. A maid from the Kennington district reported a woman matching her description being taken into a carriage this morning by a man in a black coat. They went to a townhouse on Mayfield Crescent, number 9. It belongs to a Mr. Basil Corwin. Holmes's eyes flashed. Prepare a cab, he ordered, and send word to Lestrade. We may need Scotland Yard's presence before the night is through. Mayfield Crescent was a quiet curve of Georgian homes, their facades neat and stately, their windows dark with drawn curtains. We arrived just past 9. No lights shone in number 9, but a faint glow leaked from the upper window, flickering, uncertain, like a gas lamp dimmed by shadows. Holmes motioned to the constables to hold back. We approached the door together, Holmes producing a skeleton key from his coat. The lock gave with a soft click. Inside, the house was silent. The scent of tobacco and perfume lingered faintly in the air. A single candle burned at the end of the hall, its flame dancing against the wallpaper. Holmes moved forward like a phantom, every step calculated. He gestured for me to remain behind him as we crept up the stairs. The second floor opened into a long corridor with 3 doors. One was ajar. From within came a voice, low, coaxing, persuasive. Eliza, you must believe me. I did everything I could to protect Alfred. He was in over his head. Those men, Duchesne's people, they threatened him. You saw the letters. A pause. I only need to know what he told you. For your own safety. I'm the only one who can help. Holmes signaled to me, then stepped forward. He pushed the door open gently. Inside sat Miss Whittaker, pale but unbound, her face tight with suspicion. Across from her, in an armchair, lounged Basil Corwin, his smile still in place, but his eyes wide with surprise. Mr. Corwin, Holmes said smoothly, so good to see you again. Forgive the intrusion. Corwin rose sharply. Holmes, this is a private matter. Indeed, Holmes replied. Private enough to involve threats, fire, abduction, and possibly 3 murders. Corwin turned to Eliza. You called him? I didn't, she said. He found me. Holmes stepped fully into the room, his tone now sharp. You used the myth of Duchesne to your advantage. You planted the letters. You had access to Whittaker's belongings. You likely even forged his signature. You have no proof, Corwin said coolly. Holmes smiled. Not yet. But we have a ledger, letters addressed from Duchesne to Whittaker, and a locket containing a photo of you, with a scar you've since tried to conceal with clever hair styling. You weren't just Whittaker's friend, Mr. Corwin. You were his handler, and when he tried to expose you, you made him vanish. Corwin moved suddenly, his hand darting inside his coat. But before he could draw whatever weapon lay there, 2 constables burst in behind us, pinning him to the floor. Holmes turned to Miss Whittaker, offering her his hand. You're safe now, Miss Whittaker. And thanks to your courage, so are countless others who would have been buried under your brother's silence. She looked at Holmes, then at Corwin, lying sprawled on the floor in fury and defeat. He was the face in the fog, she whispered. No, Holmes said. He merely wore the mask. The fog, like all good illusions, only lingers until someone brings light. Chapter 11. The Bait, Holmes's Grand Strategy. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the fog had begun to clear at last, replaced by the chill clarity of a spring night. Corwin was in police custody, his protests growing more desperate by the hour. Yet Holmes, far from triumphant, appeared only more contemplative as he lit his pipe and stared into the fire. "The net has closed around him, Watson," he said. "But something still troubles me." "Troubles you?" I said, settling into my chair. "He abducted Miss Whittaker. He manipulated Whittaker's death or disappearance. He created the letters, forged documents. Surely he's guilty," Holmes said, "but not alone. Corwin is clever, yes, but there are strands here too fine to be of his weaving. He does not possess the subtlety to engineer the larger illusion." I frowned. "You think someone else is still at large?" Holmes nodded. "Corwin was the visible hand, but not the brain. There's a deeper mind guiding this, one we've not yet seen, one who prefers to remain hidden in the fog." He rose and crossed to the desk, where the red notebook still lay open. He tapped the final page. "Disguise complete. D to assume identity. Witness disposal arranged." Holmes muttered, "There is a shadow behind D. Someone who orchestrated the entire scheme with a precision far beyond Corwin's reach." A pause. Then Holmes turned to me with sudden resolve. "I must bring this figure out of hiding, Watson, and to do that, we shall lay bait." I blinked. "What sort of bait?" "Corwin's arrest will soon reach the newspapers," Holmes said. "Our unseen puppeteer will read it, and if my instincts are correct, he will fear exposure, especially if he believes we have more evidence than we truly do." He picked up a pen and began scribbling a notice. "I shall leak a false report to the press that a sealed envelope containing Alfred Whittaker's full confession has been recovered and will be opened at Scotland Yard on Friday morning. The time, the place, the bait, everything will be public." I leaned forward. "You're hoping the true architect will make a move?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, Watson. I know he will, because his entire scheme depends on secrecy. If he believes we possess the final key to the arrangement, he must strike before it's revealed." "And what about Miss Whittaker?" "She is under police protection as of this morning. Sergeant Donnelly is watching her residence from across the street. Discreet, but capable." Holmes handed me the draft of the newspaper notice. "Be so good as to take this to the Evening Gazette. Use the back entrance. No names. No fuss." As I took my coat and made for the door, I turned back. "Holmes, this man you suspect, the true face in the fog, who is he?" Holmes exhaled smoke, his eyes glittering. "A man we've yet to meet, Watson, but I suspect we already know his name." The following morning's Gazette carried the announcement, "New developments in the Whittaker case. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has confirmed the recovery of a sealed envelope containing information said to name the architect behind a financial conspiracy linked to the late Mr. Alfred Whittaker. The document, reportedly prepared by Mr. Whittaker himself, will be unsealed in the presence of Scotland Yard officials and legal witnesses this Friday at 11 o'clock. The city stirred. Within hours, the Yard received a surge of inquiries. Anonymous calls, foreign-sounding voices, legal threats. Holmes merely smiled and said, "They've seen the bait. Now we wait." On the eve of the staged unveiling, Holmes summoned Lestrade, who remained skeptical. "You expect this mastermind to stroll into the Yard and confess?" Lestrade scoffed. "No," Holmes said calmly. "I expect him to attempt something far more dangerous." Lestrade snorted. "You'd better be right. Otherwise, I'll look a fool in front of every editor in Fleet Street." Holmes only replied, "Better a fool briefly, Inspector, than a corpse eternally." As Friday approached, I felt it too, that intangible weight pressing down on the city. Something was coming. Something that had hidden in shadow now felt cornered. And as Holmes paced beneath the gaslight of our sitting room, his eyes glinting with anticipation, I realized the game was no longer one of deduction. It had become a trap. And someone, clever, ruthless, and watching, was about to step into it. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Friday morning dawned clear and cold. For the first time in days, the fog had entirely vanished, revealing the city in a brittle, pale light that seemed to sharpen every edge and deepen every shadow. Holmes and I arrived at Scotland Yard just after 10 o'clock. A large envelope, unsealed and entirely empty, sat on the inspector's desk, the bait in all its deceptive glory. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with his usual suspicion, though he had begun, however grudgingly, to defer to Holmes in matters of subtlety. "Well," Lestrade muttered, rubbing his hands together, "we've got 2 constables by the doors, 1 at each window, and a plainclothes man watching the alley. If your phantom does show, we'll have him." Holmes barely nodded. His eyes, alert and searching, roved the room like a hound, testing the scent of something just out of reach. "No last-minute word from Corwin?" Holmes asked. "Still denies everything," Lestrade said, though he went oddly quiet when he heard about the supposed confession. "If there's someone pulling his strings, he's not naming names." Holmes stepped to the window. Outside, the yard's courtyard bustled with clerks, errand boys, and the occasional solicitor. At a glance, it all looked mundane, but Holmes's eyes narrowed at one particular figure. A man in a dove-grey overcoat, face half obscured by a high collar and a low hat, stood across the street pretending to read a newspaper. Holmes turned from the window. "He's here," he said softly. "He'll not enter directly. He'll wait to see who collects the envelope. If no one emerges, he'll make a move. He must confirm whether the document is genuine." Lestrade frowned. "You think he'll break in?" "No," Holmes replied. "He'll find a proxy, someone within, someone overlooked." He stepped quickly into the corridor, his hand gesturing for me to follow. We passed down 2 flights of stairs and into the basement level of the yard, where clerical work was done and foot traffic was sparse. Holmes paused at a narrow window that opened into a dim service alley. It was ajar. "Recently opened," Holmes said. "Watson, be ready." We waited only a few minutes more before the sound of a door creaked open above. A shadow moved silently down the stairs. It was a clerk, young, pale, with the nervous gait of one accustomed to being invisible. He glanced left, then made for the basement office where the envelope had been placed. Holmes stepped into his path. "Looking for something?" The boy froze, eyes wide. I was just..." Holmes lifted the edge of the empty envelope. "A message, was it? Something you were told to collect?" The clerk hesitated, then bolted. Holmes was faster. In a blur, he seized the boy by the collar and pinned him against the wall. "Who sent you?" he demanded. "The man outside. Grey coat, low hat." The boy trembled. "I don't know his name. He paid me, said there was a package, said if I got it, he'd clear my father's debts. That's all I know, I swear." Lestrade appeared moments later with 2 constables. Holmes handed the clerk over with instructions to detain and question him gently. But Holmes wasn't done. He turned sharply and strode back to the main floor, heading straight for the courtyard outside. The man in the grey coat had begun to walk away. Sensing the disturbance, Holmes quickened his pace, weaving through carriages and passers-by until he reached the far corner of the square. Then, with quiet precision, he called out, "Mr. Edward Mallory, I presume." The man stopped. He turned. And in that moment I saw Holmes's eyes widen with something I had not seen in him in weeks. Recognition. Mallory, if that was his name, did not flinch. He simply smiled, a tight, practiced smile, and tipped his hat. "I was wondering how long it would take you," he said. Holmes stared at him. "I should have seen it from the beginning. The timing, the structure. You built this puzzle not for concealment, but to be solved. That's why it felt familiar. Mallory's eyes gleamed. A man must leave a signature, Holmes. Otherwise, what's the point of art? Lestrade arrived, breathless. You know this man? Holmes's voice was cold. Edward Mallory, former legal advisor to the Bank of Liège, disgraced for embezzlement, vanished 5 years ago, re-emerged in Paris under a false name, recruited Corwin, built the illusion of Duchesne. Mallory offered no denial. Pity, he said. It was a beautiful fog. Then he ran. Holmes did not pursue. He simply raised his cane and tripped him in one clean motion. Mallory fell hard to the cobblestones, and the constables were upon him. As he was dragged to his feet, Mallory looked at Holmes one last time. You saw the whole design, he said. Did it please you? Holmes's reply was quiet. It satisfied me. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The arrest of Edward Mallory caused a greater stir at Scotland Yard than Holmes had anticipated. Word spread swiftly through the corridors that the ghost behind the Whittaker affair had been caught. But if Holmes expected a smooth conclusion, it was not to be. For Mallory, even in custody, remained as dangerous as when he was free. That evening, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in silence. He had said little after the arrest, his mind already at work on something deeper. He will not go quietly, Holmes finally muttered, as he stirred his tea without drinking it. Men like Mallory never do. He did not weave this labyrinth merely for profit. There was pride in it, identity. His entire being is wrapped in this illusion. You mean to say he might try to escape? Holmes interrupted. Not only that, he may attempt to rewrite the ending entirely. He's cornered, yes, but he still has a few pieces on the board. We were interrupted by a knock at the door. A telegram had arrived. Holmes took it with a curt nod and unfolded it by the firelight. To Sheich. Urgent. Mallory to be transferred to Wandsworth at dawn. Orders signed. But man in charge of escort is unfamiliar. Signed in under false name. Suspect an inside hand. Lestrade. Holmes stood at once. There, he's already begun. But how? I asked. He's in custody. He has friends, Watson. Or more likely, servants bought with promises and threats. If Mallory escapes tonight, the trail vanishes with him. By 10 o'clock, we were at Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade met us at the back entrance. His brow furrowed with unease. I checked the register myself, he said. The name listed for Mallory's escort is Samuel Pritchard. Never served in this division. I've sent men to verify, but... Holmes held up a hand. Too late. He'll make the attempt before verification arrives. We descended to the cells. Mallory sat calmly on the bench inside his locked chamber, coat folded neatly beside him. He looked up with something that passed for amusement. Mr. Holmes, he said. Did you come to bid me farewell? Holmes didn't smile. You'll find it difficult to escape from a locked iron cell. Mallory merely raised an eyebrow. And yet I did once before. Brussels, 1897. You recall, I'm sure. Holmes said nothing. Mallory leaned forward, his tone cool and deliberate. A trap is still a story, Holmes, and every story requires a finale. I won't die in chains. Not after all this. Lestrade signaled the constable to remain nearby and double the guard. Holmes left the cell block without another word, but I saw it in his face. A shift, a calculation already underway. We didn't return home that night. Holmes requested access to the Yard's records room, an archive of old cases and long-buried files. He scoured every sheet that bore Mallory's name. Dozens of aliases, false deaths, shell corporations. The man had vanished and reappeared across Europe more times than any sane record-keeper could trace. At 3 a.m, Holmes sat back and rubbed his temple. There's one place left, he said. Where? The station house, Holmes murmured. The transfer to Wandsworth. It's not just an escape route. It's the final stage. Mallory has arranged something only he and his handler know. Handler? I asked. Holmes met my gaze. The one officer whose signature appears on every stage of Mallory's paperwork. Transfers, searches, visitation rights. A man named Gordon Tetch. Tetch? I said. But he's respected? Long-standing? That's exactly why he was chosen. He's been compromised. We returned to the cell block just before dawn. Holmes carried a briefcase, one containing the red notebook, the locket, and the ledger Mallory had hoped to destroy. Lestrade had arranged for Tetch to be delayed. And just as expected, at 4:45 a.m., a man in constable uniform appeared at the holding cell, paperwork in hand. "Prisoner transfer," he said crisply. Holmes stepped out of the shadows. "To whom?" The man blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Rank and number," Holmes said sharply. There was a pause. Then, without a word, the man bolted down the corridor. This time Holmes did not need to chase him. Lestrade was waiting at the other end. The false escort was seized and disarmed, and within moments the real officer, Tetch himself, was brought in under suspicion. His face, pale with shock, told the whole story. Mallory had not worked alone. In his cell, Mallory still sat calmly. But when the sound of struggle echoed through the corridor, he closed his eyes. Holmes stepped inside once more. "You failed," he said. Mallory opened his eyes. "Not yet," he said. "You forget. I wrote the script." Holmes gave a quiet smile. "Then allow me to write the epilogue." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue. Revealed the attempted escape had failed, and yet there was no air of triumph as we stepped back into the sitting room at Baker Street later that morning. Holmes said little on the journey home, his brows furrowed, eyes distant, not in confusion, but in deep thought. The pieces were before him, I could tell. They had been all along, but now, at last, they were beginning to click into place. We sat before the hearth as the kettle hissed faintly in the background. Holmes drew the red notebook once more from his satchel, placing it gently on the table beside the silver locket and the small, hand-bound ledger we had retrieved from Miss Whittaker's flat days earlier. "The notebook was never written by Alfred Whittaker," Holmes said at last, his voice soft but certain. I looked up, startled, but it was in his flat. "Planted," Holmes replied. "Its handwriting was too clean, too theatrical. You'll notice how the final entries read more like coded performance than genuine fear. No man on the run from a killer composes such tidy metaphors." I opened my mouth to protest, then thought better of it. He was right. As I glanced again at the flowing, deliberate script, I felt the chill of something manufactured, less a cry for help, more a breadcrumb trail for an audience. "It was Mallory's writing, then?" I asked. "No," Holmes said. "It was intended to seem like his, but the flourishes, see here, are borrowed. They imitate the style of one George Littleton, a minor poet whose collected works were printed in Paris. And who published those editions?" I stared blankly. Holmes reached for the ledger. The Whittaker ledger shows several financial disbursements to a publishing firm in Paris. Editions Marne, a false name, no doubt, but cleverly concealed. That publisher was a front. Mallory used it to launder correspondence, funnel forged documents, and most crucially, to leak the illusion of his own death and re-emergence under the alias of Duchesne. I sat back, watching Holmes as he rose and paced slowly before the fire. "It's always been about identity," he went on. "Mallory was obsessed with masks, with reinvention. Duchesne, the mysterious financier, was never real. He was the mask, one designed to frighten Alfred Whittaker into silence. And when that failed, when Alfred began pushing back, they turned to terror." He gestured toward the locket. "That photograph," he said. was taken in Vienna, not London. You may recall, Watson, I said something was off about the reflection in the background. The lamps in that image are not British. They're gas-fed street lamps used in Austria in the 1880s. But why forge the locket? I asked. To link Corwin to the threat, Holmes answered. Mallory planted it on Miss Whittaker's desk not to intimidate her, but to direct suspicion. Corwin was indeed his accomplice, but expendable. Once his usefulness was gone, Mallory intended to let him burn in the fire of the law. It was misdirection again. Always misdirection. And what of the fire itself? I asked. That seemed impromptu. Holmes nodded. Ah, yes, the fire. That was the moment the plan faltered. Mallory had not accounted for Miss Whittaker returning early that evening. He had instructed his agent, likely the same false constable, to torch the property and destroy any remaining evidence. But when Eliza was seen inside, they pivoted. They saved her, played the hero, hoping to earn her trust long enough to learn what she knew. He stopped then, standing very still. And that, Holmes said quietly, is where the game turned. A knock at the door interrupted him. Lestrade stepped inside, holding a thin stack of letters. These were taken from Mallory's cell. He managed to hide them in the mattress. You'll want to see the last one. Holmes took the letter, unfolded it slowly, and read it aloud. To be delivered only if the envelope is not recovered. Phase 2 requires that the remaining accounts be emptied. Move the funds under the name C.W. The second ledger is still in the old place. Holmes stared at the signature. It was not signed D or Mallory. It read simply, Elias Morrow. Holmes blinked once. Then he smiled. Watson, he said, the final piece has arrived. Eliza's father, I asked. But he's dead, Holmes interrupted. Or so we believed. But Elias Morrow was an alias Whittaker himself used during early deals with continental clients. That signature confirms it. He tapped the edge of the letter. Alfred Whittaker is alive. Chapter 15. The final gathering. It was just past noon when Holmes made the arrangements, his instructions swift and precise, his tone clipped with certainty. I had seen Holmes at the height of revelation before, those moments when the scattered grains of mystery aligned into a single line of truth, but never with such focused intensity. The discovery that Alfred Whittaker was not dead, but alive and operating under a false identity, had turned the entire affair on its head. We shall not confront him in some alley or dim-lit flat, Holmes declared. This masquerade must end in the light. By late afternoon, every suspect still within reach had been summoned under the guise of a legal review. The drawing room of a quiet legal society off Chancery Lane was selected, a neutral ground, formal and discreet. Holmes believed a courtroom would impose pressure, and a private home might grant someone an opportunity to vanish. Here, in a respectable yet watchful setting, the truth would be laid bare. When I arrived at the hall, Lestrade was already present, leaning against the back wall with folded arms and no small degree of irritation. "This is unorthodox, Holmes," he muttered. "I'd prefer a formal interview." "You shall have one," Holmes replied, "after the curtain falls." The guests began arriving shortly thereafter. Miss Eliza Whittaker was first, escorted by Sergeant Donnelly. She looked nervous but determined, her face pale beneath her veil. Then came Basil Corwin, brought in under guard from his holding cell, still smug despite his restraints. Lastly, the man called Edward Mallory, led by 2 constables and flanked tightly. He walked with the same calm arrogance he had displayed since the beginning, his eyes sweeping the room like a chessboard. "You gather us all like players before the final act," Mallory said lightly. "Shall we guess our roles?" Holmes ignored him and turned instead to the chair beside the fireplace, empty for the moment. A faint tension hummed in the air as the clock ticked steadily toward 5. Then the door opened once more, and in stepped a man I did not recognize. He was tall, silver-haired, with a cane and a fine wool coat. His face was aged, lined with weather and time, but there was something familiar about the mouth, the posture, the way he did not flinch beneath the stares of the assembled. "Eliza," he said softly. The girl rose, stunned. "Father!" It was like the breath had been knocked from the room. Lestrade stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes raised a hand. "Let him speak." Alfred Whitaker removed his gloves and laid them on the table beside the ledger. He looked not at Holmes, nor at the police, but directly at Eliza. "I never meant for you to be drawn into this. I thought by vanishing I was protecting you." "But they said you were dead," she whispered. "I saw the letters, the threats, your photograph in the locket." Whitaker's jaw tightened. "All planted. I staged it. With Mallory's help. At first." Mallory laughed from his seat. "You see? Even the ghost had a master." Holmes stepped forward, his voice precise. "Alfred Whitaker orchestrated the illusion of his death to escape the consortium he once helped build. But when he tried to extract himself, he found himself outmatched by the very people he had empowered. Mallory was only too happy to keep the illusion going, for his own benefit." Whitaker nodded. "I wanted to bring the whole operation down. But I lacked the means, the records, the proof. So I vanished, changed names. I needed to wait, to see who would emerge, who would betray whom. And then," Holmes added, "you realized your sister had unwittingly become the key. You returned too late to warn her, but just in time to try and stop them from silencing her." Whitaker turned to Mallory. "You twisted everything." "I refined it," Mallory said smugly. "Your name had power. I merely used it more efficiently." Holmes's voice grew colder. "You used it to manipulate, to kill, and to destroy reputations." He turned to Lestrade. "You have your suspects. Corwin for conspiracy, Mallory for fraud, attempted murder, and impersonation, and Whitaker." He paused, glancing at Eliza. "Whitaker must answer for his choices, but not in the shadows. Not through silence." The silence in the room held for a long moment. Then Whitaker stood straighter, his eyes tired but firm. "I'll give you everything," he said. "Names, accounts, locations. Just protect my sister." Lestrade nodded stiffly. As the constables led Mallory and Corwin away, I looked at Holmes, who stood still, hands folded behind his back, eyes distant. "What now?" I asked him. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the empty chair once occupied by the idea of a dead man. "Now," Holmes said at last, "we let the truth speak." Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The following morning, Holmes summoned me early. He had barely slept, and though his expression remained composed, I saw a peculiar light in his eyes, the kind that appears only when his mind has finally caged the beast it had been hunting. "I believe," he said, pouring tea with absent precision, "it is time we draw the curtain fully and present the matter in its true shape. The facts are at last complete." At Holmes's insistence, a formal briefing was arranged within the chambers of Scotland Yard. Present were Inspector Lestrade, Eliza Whitaker, Alfred Whitaker, now under protective custody, and a gathering of senior Yard officials. Mallory and Corwin were held in cells nearby, their influence no longer enough to shield them from the weight of Holmes's conclusions. The air was tense as Holmes stood before the room, the red notebook in one hand, a slender cane in the other. He looked not at any single man, but beyond them all, as though addressing the very architecture of the deception. "This case," he began, "is not about a single crime. It is about illusion, manipulation, and control. What appeared at first as a simple abduction was, in truth, the final act of a long and intricate con, crafted not by one man, but by a triumvirate of deceit: Alfred Whitaker, Basil Corwin, and Edward Mallory." A murmur rose among the Yard's officials. Holmes raised his hand to still them. Alfred Whitaker, he continued, nodding toward the man seated at the far end of the table, was once a man of considerable means and ambition. He built a shadow consortium, an illicit network of financial fronts stretching across the Channel. When he grew uneasy with its power, he attempted to withdraw, but like many who deal in shadows, he found the darkness would not release him so easily. He tapped the red notebook. This book, which appeared to be a plea for help, was in fact a carefully staged prop, planted by Mallory using Whitaker's own words and allusions to throw off any investigators who might grow too curious. It was a red herring, but one rooted in truth. Holmes turned slightly. Basil Corwin, once Whitaker's aide and errand runner, was the means by which Mallory extended his control. When Whitaker vanished, Corwin stepped into the vacuum and kept the machinery moving, letters, threats, payments, always using the specter of Duchesne to inspire fear. But Duchesne, as we now know, was merely a fiction, a name without a face. He opened the silver locket and passed it to Lestrade. "Even this," he said, "was staged. The photo within it is from Vienna, not London. The subject, a supposed enemy of Whitaker, is no more real than Duchesne himself. Mallory and Corwin used it to convince Miss Whitaker that her family was marked by something far greater than greed or ambition. In truth, the only danger she faced was the slow unraveling of her father's secrets." Lestrade furrowed his brow. "And the fire?" "An accident within an illusion," Holmes said. The plan had been to remove Miss Whitaker, burn the evidence, and make the flat seem abandoned. When she returned unexpectedly, Corwin acted swiftly to preserve the illusion, rescuing her himself, thus earning her trust. But that act exposed him, and Mallory knew it. Holmes stepped closer to the table, placing the forged documents, the ledger, and the notebook side by side. "All of it," he said, "was misdirection. Mallory had mastered the art of the staged mystery. He knew that the more complicated the plot, the more likely it was to seem profound. But he underestimated one truth. The mind that creates the illusion often leaves behind its fingerprint." Holmes tapped the final letter, the one signed Elias Morrow. That was his mistake. He tried to write the ending himself, but he used the wrong name. I leaned forward, puzzled. But wasn't Elias Morrow just another alias? Holmes turned to me with a rare smile. "Yes, Watson. An alias used by Alfred Whitaker, but not one Mallory should have known, which means only Whitaker could have written that letter, and by doing so, he unwittingly revealed he had been watching from the shadows far longer than he claimed." Eliza's hand tightened on the armrest beside her. "You mean Father knew everything?" Holmes's gaze softened. He was not the villain, but nor was he innocent. He planted the seeds of this deception and lost control of the garden. His decision to vanish created a void into which men like Mallory and Corwin were only too eager to step. Holmes turned back to the table. "There is your truth. 3 men built a lie. One ran from it, one profited, and one tried to burn the evidence, but in the end, it was their vanity, not their planning, that betrayed them." There was silence. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Well, I suppose that settles it. I'll see to their indictments myself." As the officers began gathering the materials, I glanced at Holmes, who stood still, eyes distant again. I knew the case was solved, but I also knew by the quiet way he lit his pipe and looked out the window that some mysteries, particularly those crafted in fog, never left him entirely. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. In the days following Holmes's dramatic revelation at Scotland Yard, the city's legal machinery creaked into motion with the slow, deliberate weight of inevitability. Edward Mallory and Basil Corwin were formally charged with conspiracy to defraud, arson, attempted murder, and a host of financial crimes too complex for even Lestrade to recite without notes. Alfred Whittaker, though not placed in irons, was held under official scrutiny pending further investigation, his cooperation buying him a measured leniency. It was not a satisfying resolution for everyone, least of all Eliza Whittaker. I found her at our Baker Street flat one grey morning, seated quietly near the window, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Holmes had invited her, though I suspected he did so not out of courtesy, but out of a silent, unspoken responsibility he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You have been quiet," Holmes said, offering her tea without looking at her. She accepted it with a nod. "I've had much to consider." Holmes studied her for a moment. "You are disappointed in your father." She looked up, surprised. "Yes, but more than that. I'm disappointed in the story I told myself about him." Holmes's gaze softened. He did what he believed necessary. That does not make it right, nor worthy of admiration. But he chose silence over betrayal. "He chose silence over me," she replied bitterly. There was nothing to say to that. Holmes did not try. She finished her tea, then rose, her back straight. "Will I be allowed to see him?" she asked. Holmes nodded. "He has asked for you." And that, it seemed, brought her a measure of peace. Corwin, predictably, folded under pressure. Within a week, he had provided a detailed confession. Each transaction, each forged document, each meeting with Mallory, laid bare with a mixture of resignation and spite. His only request was that his sentence be reduced in exchange for full cooperation. Mallory was less obliging. His trial began with a flourish. A sharp-featured solicitor attempted to reframe the entire affair as a misguided business venture taken out of context. But Holmes, having prepared meticulously, appeared as chief witness, dismantling Mallory's entire facade with surgical clarity. By the time he finished testifying, the courtroom sat in rapt silence, the weight of the deception fully realized. The jury returned within 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Mallory, ever composed, merely nodded and turned toward Holmes as the verdict was read. "You do know," he said softly, "you've merely ended one chapter. The game goes on." Holmes gave no reply. Corwin was sentenced to 12 years in Dartmoor prison. Mallory to life. Alfred Whittaker's fate, however, was more nuanced. His decision to disappear, to fabricate his own death and finance criminal enterprises, could not go unpunished. But his cooperation, especially in identifying foreign agents and fraudulent channels, carried considerable weight. The court deferred his sentencing, allowing him a chance to continue aiding international investigations from custody. When Holmes told Eliza this, she was quiet for a long time. "He'll always be running," she said. "Not anymore," Holmes replied. "He's been found." Back at Baker Street, as the final pieces of the case were boxed away, I found Holmes at his desk, staring thoughtfully into the fireplace. "You've seemed unsettled," I said, "though the case is over." "Cases do not end, Watson," Holmes murmured. "Only the telling of them does." He reached for a small slip of paper tucked into the spine of the red notebook. It was a line Mallory had written, a final flourish intended to impress or perhaps disturb. "Truth is merely the mask that fits best." Holmes scoffed softly. "The irony," he said, "is that Mallory believed himself the author of reality. But he failed to realize the one truth no criminal ever escapes." "What's that?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, his eyes calm and clear, "that the mind which builds the illusion cannot see outside it." We sat in silence after that, the London fog creeping back over the rooftops, as if the city itself had been waiting for the story to end. And in the corner, beneath the shadow of the bookshelf, the red notebook lay shut at last. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was a week after the verdict when the fog finally lifted from London. A rare clarity settled over the rooftops and gas lamps, and for a brief span of days, the city felt as though it had taken a long breath and exhaled. Yet at 291B Baker Street, that sense of peace was not mirrored. Holmes remained quiet and distant, spending his hours deep in the armchair by the fire or pacing the floor in his robe, lost in some internal contemplation. The case of Alfred Whittaker and the face in the fog had concluded. The files had been returned to Scotland Yard. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals. But Holmes, he lingered. I found him at the window on the morning of the 10th day, staring out at the street below with his hands folded behind his back. "Still brooding over Mallory's words?" I asked, offering him a cup of tea. He took it absently, not answering right away. "I've been thinking," he said at last, "about the nature of masks." "Masks?" I echoed. "Yes. Every player in this affair wore one. Whittaker, the father who vanished to save his daughter, but in truth feared the consequences of his own ambition. Mallory, the master of shadows, convinced he could become invisible behind layers of fiction. Corwin, who pretended loyalty while selling secrets for coin. Even Miss Whittaker wore one. The loyal daughter, eager for truth, yet unsure she could face it." He turned from the window, his eyes sharp but distant. "And I too wear one, Watson." I looked at him in surprise. "You?" Holmes smiled faintly. The mask of detachment, of indifference. "It is useful, of course. It keeps me focused. But cases like this remind me of its cost." I sat down across from him, unsure how to reply. "You saw Eliza's face," he continued quietly. "She did not cry when she learned the truth. She didn't rage. She simply looked tired, as though reality had worn through the last of her defenses." "She has her father back," I offered. Holmes shook his head. "Not truly. She has a man who was her father once. But he has become a story even he no longer recognizes." There was a pause. Then Holmes leaned forward, selecting the red notebook from the shelf. He opened it and tore out the final page, the one containing Mallory's poetic musing. "Truth is merely the mask that fits best." He held it to the fire. "Incorrect," he said as the paper curled into smoke. "Truth is not a mask. It is the face underneath, weathered and plain." The room filled with the faint scent of burnt paper. Holmes settled back in his chair. "Will you record this one?" he asked me. "Of course," I replied. "I've already begun." He closed his eyes. "Leave out the theatrics," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the fog, the fire, the false names?" He gave a low chuckle. "No. I mean leave out the moment when I supposedly stood still, eyes blazing, and delivered my deductions like a thunderclap." "But you did," I protested. It was quite stirring. Holmes opened one eye. "Did it happen exactly that way, Watson?" I paused. "Close enough." He nodded. "Then include it." We shared a quiet laugh. Later that day, I walked alone through Bloomsbury, the winter sun casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. I thought of Eliza Whittaker and the strength in her silence. I thought of Corwin, already forgotten by the world he had once manipulated. And I thought, too, of Edward Mallory, sitting behind stone walls, still convinced he had authored a grand illusion. But most of all, I thought of Holmes, of the man who had unraveled it all with quiet brilliance, only to sit afterward in the stillness of his own thoughts. For while the world praised his genius, they rarely saw the solitude it left behind. That night, I returned to Baker Street and found Holmes asleep in the chair, the fire low, the locket resting on the table beside him, closed now and perhaps finally at peace. And I knew that whatever fog the city might conjure next, Holmes would be ready.